Yes, Doreen Huizer is next up, my co-chair. She was, when I got to know her, she was the data manager in the Evelien Kronen Lab at Leiden University. And she was there dedicated and especially hired, I think, to apply open science principles in the research of all lab members. I think in this way, she was a great example to all. And last year, the entire lab moved to Rotterdam, to the Erasmus, where she's now a lab manager and the data manager of, if I'm correct, the Erasmus Sync Lab and the LSIT Twin Study. And I think among other great contributions, she has created tools for sharing neuroimaging data. And today she will showcase some of this work. So thanks for being here, Doreen, and for co-chairing this session. And we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Let's see if screen sharing actually works. Are you seeing the correct screen? Okay, I'm seeing nodding head. Nice. I'm also going to try this. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So I'll be sharing a little bit of some data sharing tips. And they're probably going to be a little bit general because there's not enough time to go into neuroscience specifically. But I think these general recommendations are also really important. So, yeah. So first of all, why would you ever share research data? So I think Remy already gave some great arguments for that. And there are many reasons to share, but I will highlight a few. So firstly, in order to reproduce your results, it's quite handy if you share the data with others so that they can actually do it. This also increases the confidence in your findings because you allow others to verify your results. Sharing research data also increases the reusability of your data. So others may also use your data for other purposes or maybe other research questions if they want than what you use them for. I think it increases or has the potential to increase collaboration. For example, on a specific data set, if others are also interested in that data set, then you can share them with them or collaborate with them on the data set. And I think it's also good for your career. So one thing is if you share your research data well, then you can also get credit for the data. So besides the papers, your data set can also be cited. And of course, it also shows that you're willing to be transparent and open about your way of work. And that you're also willing to make mistakes because, let's be honest, if you share data, there could be mistakes in there. And I think if you're willing to accept that, that's really awesome, etc. So there are also many other reasons, of course. So before you do anything with data, I think it's important to write a data management plan. And many funders and institutions already require people to write a data management plan. And in the in the data sharing section of such a plan, you record what you want to share, with whom, where, and when, and also maybe how. So, for example, in the what to share section, you may want to consider if you are collecting privacy-sensitive data and how you're going to anonymize the data. And otherwise, if you cannot anonymize the data, you have to plan for obtaining consent. How large are the data? What type of files do you have? What data do you want to share? Do you want to share raw data, processed data, data underlying a manuscript, or from an entire project, which may sometimes be different? With whom do you want to share? For example, in public, but you can also only share with collaborators or with academic researchers, or not at all. And there are good reasons, valid reasons, to not share raw data. For example, privacy, intellectual property rights, and commercial interests. And those are all valid reasons not to share data. But that shouldn't hold you back from sharing whatever you can, of course. And also, of course, where to share the data is also a really important one. So the recommended way is to share it in a trusted repository, which I will be talking about soon as well. Sharing case by case is not recommended because you don't really have a lot of control over what people will do with your data. And it's also not fair, not a fair way of sharing. So I'll get back to that as well. And what's also often possible is that you, instead of sharing data publicly, you share it on request or after an embargo period, or after, for example, signing a usage agreement or additional conditions. And how the community data standards, I think, have been addressed. So, for example, using the BIT standard for your data. So one term that is really, really important in data sharing is FAIR. And FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And it's sort of the ideal for research data. So it's the end goal of if you want to share data. However, do realize that it's often not possible to achieve 100% fair data. It's just the goal is to make your data as fair as possible, but it's not always possible to do everything in terms of fair. So the findable stands for in practice. So it's a bit more complicated than I'm putting on this slide. But in practice, fair means that you put your data in a repository. And if you cannot share your data, you can at least share your metadata. And what that is, I'll explain soon. And in the repository, there should be human and machine readable metadata, which will be taken care of often by the repository itself, so you won't have to think about that yourself. And your dataset should get a persistent identifier. For example, a digital object identifier, like a paper also gets. And this is also something that the repository takes care of often. Accessible means that you have to specify how the data can be accessed. So this can also mean that the data are not accessible. This information should be there somewhere. And it also means that if the data are somewhere, that there's a license to the data. So in the license, you specify what people can do with the data. So one example is the CC BY license, which is also often used for papers. And in a CC BY license, people can do sort of whatever they want, but they have to acknowledge the source of where they got the data. And the metadata should always be available. This is also something that the repository should take care of. Then interoperable means that you should use semantic vocabularies. And this is a bit complicated and complex. You don't have to be able to understand it exactly all yourself. But that sort of means that the contents are unambiguous and can be interpreted automatically by machines. For example, that you're using ontologies and thesauri and taxonomies. And this is typically something that you ask for help with, because we shouldn't expect researchers to know all this by themselves. Another point in interoperability is interlinking metadata, so that also machines know that certain outputs are related. So for example, a very simple example is if you refer to a data set from your paper and from the data set to your paper, for example. Then reusability means that you provide provenance information. So how were these data actually created? Use community standards such as the BIT standard, which I'm not going to explain anymore because that's been touched upon twice already. And to use sustainable file formats. So one very simple example of a non-sustainable file format is if you use Excel, because that's a proprietary format that can only be opened with Microsoft Excel. So it's recommended to use, for example, comma-separated files or tab-separated files, which may contain the same information, but they can be opened with many tools, also open source tools. Before I move on to the next slide, I would like to highlight these three sources here. So the How to Fair website is actually really useful for practical tips on how to make your data fair. And this Fair Aware tool by DANS, which is an data institute in the Netherlands, is also really handy because it makes you aware of what it means to make your data fair. So one term that is often a bit ambiguous is metadata. Actually, what metadata is creating information for you and maybe also for computers to understand your data sets. So you can have a CSV file with all kinds of numbers, But if there's no metadata, you have no idea what the data are about. So there are many ways to categorize metadata, but for your understanding, you can have project level information, such as the title, description, version of the data set, the researchers that were involved, methods, information on reuse, such as licenses, information on the data structuring and versioning, which is done very well in bits. And this type of information is often already, there are already fields in a repository. So you don't really have to provide that explicitly, but it's already useful if you have that information ready on your local computer, for example, in a README file, which is very simple to write text file. And then there's data level information, which is also really important. Which variables are actually present in the data sets and what do they mean? What labels do they have? What data type is it? When were the data created? And also notable cases in the data set, or when something happens during data collection. That's also really important information if you want to analyze the data, for example. And this type of information is a bit often, well, it varies a lot in which format this is. In bits, it's often in a JSON file, which is a machine readable file as well, sort of a dictionary type file. But I can also imagine that if you have lab notes that you use a tabular file such as TSV or CSV data, or an Excel file, of course, which is not recommended.
Doreen, you have a few minutes left.
Yeah, so, okay.
Please check.
Yeah, then I'll skip some information. So what to share is about privacy. So if you collect personal data, you need to anonymize the data. And anonymous means that the data is not traceable at all. Re-identification is not possible. And if your data are anonymous, you can simply share them. But if you collect personal data, then you cannot. You have to use a legal basis in order to do so. We often use informed consent. So, for example, already with the zip code and gender and the date of birth, already 87% of US citizens who are identifiable. So it's often very easy to identify people with a small combination of demographic variables. So we really want to anonymize the data as much as possible. So I will skip this slide, but the message is that there's not really consensus whether brain MRI data, human brain MRI data, is privacy sensitive information. At the moment, it's often seen as privacy sensitive information, so we need to contact privacy officers or obtain informed consent if we want to do anything with that kind of data. But that's often institution and country dependent as well. So in the USA, those rules are a bit more lenient as well. And indeed, we developed an MRI data sharing guide to help researchers with this issue. So if you have my slides, you can click the link, and I'll also paste it in the chat. And then where to share? There are many repositories available, such as OpenNeuro, which is a USA-based repository. So if you do share MRI data there, you need to have a legal basis or an okay from your privacy officer that the data are anonymous. The NeuroVault is for statistical maps for MRI data, for neuroimaging data, sorry. And then there's also all kinds of general repositories such as Figshare, Zenodo, Open Science Framework, and in the Netherlands we have Dataverse and DansEasy, which are maintained by Dans. But the general message is, if you want to search for a repository to share your data in, go to re3data.org, because it's sort of the repository of repositories, so you can search for a repository there. Open science is overwhelming, and it's not always possible to know everything by yourself. So my advice is to contact data support. At every university, there's always someone who can help you. And I think more and more institutions are hiring, for example, data stewards, but also privacy officers who can help you with research data management and data sharing. And every university has an open science community. So if you're not a member yet, go be a member, or ask on Twitter if you don't want to be a part of the community. So there's lots of points to ask for help. And with that, that was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that you actually showed the picture of the Netherlands and all the open science communities, because I was planning to do that in the end, saying, okay, if you are, if you want to learn more, go to your local open science community. So there's one in every university. That's very good.
Exactly.
We have 1 minute for questions, I would say, if there are any. And otherwise, we can maybe continue, because then we can catch up a little bit in time.
Yes.
I will stop recording for this part.